Punishment or decriminalization? For the first time in nearly 20 years, the UN is holding a special session on drug policy. But will there be a consensus on how to best approach the use and sale of drugs around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The global debate on drug policy is at a turning point. Around the world, experts are questioning the conventional wisdom that says to eradicate drugs, you have to punish the people who produce and consume them. Well, the U.S. was the architect of the so-called war on drugs. And now a number of its states are either debating or have already legalized cannabis. Similar moves towards decriminalization or liberalization of drug policy are happening in Canada, Mexico and Colombia. They've already happened in Uruguay and in Portugal. And now, for the first time in nearly 20 years, the UN is to hold a special session on drug policy. When diplomats met last time, they agreed on an ambitious but ultimately unattainable goal of ridding the world of illegal drugs by 2008. But a lot has changed since then. And a growing chorus of leaders and medical experts are now calling on the UN to change its drug policy, with a change in focus from punishment and criminalization to treatment and human rights. Well, we're talking about a large international industry that's estimated to be worth some $380 billion a year. In 2013, the UN estimated a total of 246 million people around the world using an illicit drug. And a staggering amount of money has been spent on the drug crackdown. The U.S. alone spends over $50 billion a year. It spent $7.6 billion on stopping opium production in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2014. And despite that, Afghan opium production has reached record levels. The human cost is just as high. In Mexico alone, 164,000 people were killed between 2007 and 2014 because of the drug war. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. In New York, Daniel Wolfe, director of the International Harm Reduction Development Program at the Open Society Foundations. In Bristol, in the UK, Danny Kushlick, he's head of external affairs at the Transform think tank that campaigns for an end to the drug war. Over in Islamabad, Tariq Zafar, he's the executive director of the Nai Zindagi Trust, rights-based health and social services for persons affected by drug use, HIV and AIDS. Welcome to all of you gentlemen to Inside Story. Daniel, the numbers speak for themselves, don't they? So is it time for a change in the UN's drug policy?
Yeah, I think it's certainly clear that the consensus is broken and that the old hope, which was for a drug-free world, was both, as you said, impractical and unhelpful. I think the question now is whether this special session will actually be special and allow for the voices of reform to be lifted up, or whether it will serve us another portion of old, rewarmed drug control thinking, which is, I think, what some people in Vienna would prefer, which is where the drug control apparatus is centered. So there's a lot of tension here in New York as the session opens, and questions about which voices will be heard and which will be silenced. But
Daniel, how much responsibility does the UN itself bear on the current state of the war on drugs as it was designed by the UN?
Sure. I mean, the truth of it is that the point of the conventions, the drug conventions, was that there be one unified response to drugs. But I think what we've seen now is that many countries and communities have voted and moved to a different approach. They're not waiting for the UN. The question now is whether the UN will recognize the progress that's been made, the decriminalization in Portugal, the regulation in Uruguay of cannabis, the supervised injection facilities in Canada and North America, the changes in the U.S. states with regard to marijuana regulation, and basically say to the world, okay, we made a mistake. We didn't think about the health consequences. We didn't think about the rights consequences. We thought only about a nice-sounding slogan of a drug-free world, and now we want to retrench, rework, and reassess.
Danny, how significant is this meeting in your opinion, and what will be achieved? Will this special session be special, as Daniel put it?
Well, as Daniel said, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating here. We won't know until it ends, but there's clearly tensions. There are those countries like the Chinese and the Russians and their client states who want everything to remain the same, who want to continue fighting a futile war, a catastrophic war that is impacting worst on the most marginalized and disadvantaged peoples on earth, which is anathema completely to what the UN was set up to do.
But does the U.S. really want that? I mean, just recently, Danny, Barack Obama said this. He said, for too long, we viewed drug addiction through the lens of criminal justice, and the most important thing to do is to reduce demand, and the only way to do that is to provide treatment. This is according to the U.S. president. So there does seem to be some sort of shift in language on behalf of the United States, doesn't there?
There is a shift in language, but citizens' lives are not improved by changes in rhetoric. The changes for the poorest people and the most marginalized on earth, particularly in developing countries in the global south, will only occur when the policy changes, and ultimately that means shifting the policy away from the police and away from the military, away from interdiction, away from incarceration, emptying the prisons. The US still has by far the largest prison population on earth, 25% of the prison population and only 5% of the world's population. So the president's words need to be translated into actions, and that needs to translate right throughout the world. And ultimately, ending the war on drugs means putting control of production and supply back in the hands of governments. It means legalizing and regulating.
Would that work, Tariq, in a country like Pakistan, which has one of the highest rates of heroin addicts in the world?
Let me just say something which I think is very important. First of all, the war on drugs is basically war on drug users. It's war on the families of drug users. It's war on the children of drug users. And it's war on the general public. Because what we've seen, I've been in this work for the last 25 years. We work with street-based drug users across 3 provinces in 28 districts. And these are all poor, and I totally agree with what has been said earlier. And what has happened is that from a simple smoking of heroin, the shift has been to injecting of heroin, in which law enforcement has played a very, very big role, because it becomes more expensive, it becomes difficult to score, so people shift to injecting pharmaceuticals or injecting heroin. Now in Pakistan, for example, the 2011 figures are showing 37 to 40% prevalence of HIV among people who inject drugs. 35–40% of them are married because of sexual practices, unprotected sex. Wives are getting infected, children are getting infected. So in fact, in our context, the war on drugs has been war on the clients themselves and their families and the communities. It has failed. I mean, some of the figures that have come out of UNAIDS recently is that 100 billion in the world is spent, $100 billion are spent a year in trying to control the supply. Whereas $1.5 billion is required over the next 5 years to reach 90% of the people with evidence-based services that work. I mean, countries like Iran have adopted services that work, because I think and I believe that health is a human right and everybody should have access, you know.
So what needs to happen in Pakistan, Tariq?
We have expanded programs and we need to still expand. We still are missing one component, which is a very important component called opiate substitution, which is still not there, but needle exchange. The government has also got some programs which are quite large, and also through the Global Fund we've got programs that are large. So I would say these services need to be expanded. These services still need to be consistent. They need to be sustained. We know what we need to do. We know where the clients are. We know how to reach them. And plus, of course, that's the prevention side. Now we've got infections, so you've got to talk about treatment. So this is the way we see it. I mean, we know what we need to do. We now just need to expand.
Daniel, you think that calls for reform are growing louder? Are we at a turning point?
You know, I think it's clear that we are at a turning point. What's not clear is whether the UN, which operates by a consensus, so any one country can drive all views to a kind of lowest common denominator, will recognize the turn. You mentioned President Obama's change, and it's not just a change in rhetoric. In fact, there's money attached to that, more resources for treatment, etc. But it's often the case that what countries do domestically isn't necessarily reflected internationally. So you have many, many countries here, including all of Europe, which has practiced the kind of harm reduction that Tariq was talking about and brought HIV infections among drug injectors to basically zero, then, you know, will they stand up for harm reduction at this meeting, or will they basically say, well, we can say it another way, it will keep Russia happy, it will keep China happy, and we'll be happy. The US also has a chance to really lift up its change or to let business as usual proceed. So I think that's the challenge before the world today. There are mothers and families who are impacted by the drug war here. There are people who use drugs who are saying we haven't been consulted or basically considered in the formation of these policies. There are HIV experts. The main message of this meeting is that drugs is too important to leave to the drug control authorities. And many, many UN agencies, communities are out in force.
So what, are you saying that there's a need to regulate and strictly control the drug trade? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there are, you know, different countries have chosen a range of solutions. As Danny mentioned, and as you mentioned in your opening, for example, there are several American states that are now regulating and controlling the marijuana trade. And in fact, many people would say that they're regulating it and controlling it much better than the old model did, which, you know, the only people who considered marijuana a controlled substance were the authorities. It was very widely available to everyone without state engagement. Then there's some place like Portugal. They decriminalized, so they didn't regulate. They decriminalized all drugs up to 10 days worth. And what happened? Nothing bad. Treatment increased. HIV infections went down. Drug use did not, by and large, increase. There was not an influx of people seeking drugs to Portugal. So it was a very positive experience. And I think the question for all of us is whether we let the old drug war conventional wisdom, as you called it, dominate, or whether we actually look at the wisdom of communities that have actually used different approaches and tried to solve the problem in a different way with very positive results.
Danny, if you're going to regulate and control the drug trade, isn't that going to, is there a risk that that opens up more black markets?
Precisely the opposite. The model we would refer to in history is alcohol prohibition. Between 1920 and 1932 in the US, the alcohol prohibition created the bootlegged alcohol market and gifted the entire trade to the US mafia. In fact, it created the US mafia. The current global prohibition, the drug war, the criminalization of certain drugs, has gifted this the huge market that you talked about earlier. It's the second largest money earner for organized crime globally.
But how would it work, Danny? How would you regulate and control the use of what are very harmful and dangerous substances?
The first thing is the last people you want controlling dangerous substances is the mafia. So let's look at the counterfactual before we look at where we go. But where we go is towards doctors, pharmacists, and licensed retailers. These are the kind of people that you would want to be looking after dangerous substances. And given that they have a customer base in excess of 250 million people worldwide, it's really important that that trade is taken back by governments. And places like Afghanistan, Peru, Colombia, Mexico cannot extricate themselves from the violence, the corruption, the insecurity, the underdevelopment, the ill health, all the negative impacts that come with a misplaced, misguided, ideologically driven prohibition. They cannot achieve the kind of statehood and the kind of societies that they want to whilst the global drug war is in place. And the UN, if it sticks to its principles, the pillars of the UN are peace and security, development, human rights and health. And those are the values, the principles and the targets that drug policy ought to be heading for, not ideological and geopolitical happiness.
You mentioned a couple of countries. What I'd like to do right now is just look at the case of Nigeria for just a moment, because it's become a hub for methamphetamine production and a supplier for a global trade in drugs. Let's just listen to this story by our correspondent Ahmed Idris, who's reporting from Lagos in Nigeria.
A routine drill by officers of Nigeria's Drug Law Enforcement Agency. After a series of victories over drug trafficking, the country is facing an emerging threat: the production of the synthetic chemical methamphetamine, which is used as a recreational drug in a number of countries. What is happening here in Asaba, south of Lagos, isn't a drill. Agents raiding this huge illicit laboratory that's been churning out methamphetamine at a rate of up to 4,000 kilograms a week, they say. An indication of how West Africa is becoming the new enterprise zone for international drug cartels.
The local drug cartels in Nigeria are now forming alliances with cartels in South America. The discovery of a super lab is also an indication that we have much work to do.
The process is very simple.
The lab technicians came from the Americas, 4 Mexicans and their Nigerian hosts, and before them, some Bolivians. Cleaning up this facility with its stock of hazardous chemical will cost $150,000 US. Meth is fast becoming Nigeria's new drug threat. Not much of it will be consumed here, but South American producers are turning their attention to West Africa because of cheaper labor and weak enforcement. But Nigerian drug authorities say they are more worried about the country being turned into a major producing hub than of the local population being major consumers of the drug. Exports and imports are cleverly concealed in almost anything, from vehicle parts to food packaging. These boxes contain part of the 260 kilograms of meth seized from one individual. Local consumption of the drug is also increasing as some young Nigerians experiment with it.
It's not difficult if you go to the places where they sell them. It's not difficult. But the problem is going to the places where they sell them.
Fighting addiction is big enough a problem, but the tougher challenge lies in fighting the cartels engaged in the manufacture and trafficking of meth in Nigeria and motivating a struggling law enforcement workforce. Unless that is done quickly, West Africa may soon become a favored backyard for drug lords looking to avoid the law in Europe and America, and a danger to the local population. Ahmed Idris for Inside Story in Lagos.
Tariq, after listening to that report by a correspondent, what do you think of the situation in Nigeria? How dangerous is it? And what exactly has happened to make some countries in Africa a new hub for international drug cartels?
We've been working in Kenya over the last 3-4 years at the coastline. And what we've observed is that, yes, it's increasing. But from my perspective, even if people start using drugs, the opportunity to be able to go into treatment must be there. You know, we just try and find out one solution, lock them up, put them in prisons, and they'll get clean. So I think as long as there is available treatment, there's available access to treatment, and there's less incarceration, chances are people will fall into drugs, people will come out of drugs because it's a choice. So not providing large-scale programs where people can actually get out of the scene, maybe even relapse, go back and come out again, I think that's the first thing.
But what's at stake if these programs are not available?
If they're not available, then obviously where's the money being spent? The money is being spent on supply reduction, whereby we know that 100 billion a year is being spent. I mean, I have these papers from the recent report from UN AIDS. And coming back to the UN, I'd also like to mention that within the UN, you have UNODC, which is more emphasis on supply reduction, which is actually causing a lot of more harm than good. And then you have UNAIDS trying to say to the UN that, you know, at least when you're talking of injecting drug users, let's have treatment, let's have support, let's not incarcerate them, because then they become incubators and hubs of infections, you know, Hep C, Hep B, TB, HIV. So I think because it's for us, it's a very clear mandate. It's a public health issue. Of course, people will try drugs, people will try new drugs, people will fall off, people will stop, people will sometimes relapse and go back. But the job of public health should be to provide large-scale, uninterrupted, continuous, evidence-based, client-friendly services. And if they are there, people will obviously come out. But if it's tokenism, if it's just saying, you know, we'll just spend $100,000 on a very nice program and, you know, prepare beautiful brochures and, you know, be in the limelight so we can have more money for supply reduction, I think that's wrong.
Okay, so let me just ask you three the same question now. Should it be on a case-by-case basis when it comes to countries, or do we still need these international drug treaties? Tariq, starting with you.
Yeah. drug treaties, from our perspective, and I'm purely talking from the perspective of the client who's on the street, you know, is very far away, somewhere in Vienna or somewhere in New York. You know, the client is suffering. Now, as long as we do not provide services that are required for our clients, I'm saying our clients, I mean Pakistan, we have to look at our focus. We can't be dictated policies from, you know, glass houses where they do their research and make out their own, myths about how to help people in Pakistan. I think we as a nation need to decide what we need to do. This, like I said earlier, we know where the client is, we know what the client requires, we know what is evidence-based. So what are you waiting for?
Daniel, obviously this debate around drugs is countries are not as united as they were decades ago, but so does this make it harder to establish international drug policies in the future, and do we need these international drug policies?
I think it's useful to have international conventions and policies, but as Tariq said, there's a big gap often between international words and national or regional practice. You know, the example of Nigeria that you raised, there is a West African Commission on Drug Policy that looked at the regional response and made a series of recommendations. And these too have been a change from the usual African position. Those recommendations, which include harm reduction, access to medicines for pain relief, a realistic approach to supply reduction, reduced reliance on over-incarceration and disproportionate penalties. Those are all positive steps, and you know, one of the things that the West Africans can do and have been doing is not repeating the mistakes of other transit or production countries. So, for example, a number of West Africans traveled to Colombia to actually see what lessons they could learn there rather than repeating the same old ineffective approaches. And I think what we're going to see is regions and countries saying, fine, international conventions are important, but we're not going to wait for the UN, which has tended, unfortunately, on drugs issues to be a follower rather than a leader. We're not going to wait before we start implementing different kinds of policy responses.
But Danny, let me ask you this then. Wouldn't that leave the world and effectively countries around the world with no real international system for dealing with drugs?
Well, we need both. There is a need for, at national level and at regional level, as Tariq said, to look at the needs of citizens. But at the same time, the policies that are implemented need we need to be aware that they need to be global, because certain drugs can only be produced in certain places and then they're trafficked to other places. And under a legal regime, you would still need that. We have a framework convention on tobacco control, which is held in place at the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is a UN body. And I think that what we'd be looking for is to shift, whilst there still needs to be international norms set for how drug policy is developed and implemented throughout the world. What we need is to shift away from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and move it more into other UN agencies, primarily the World Health Organization, which overarchingly has a public health remit. And once you put in place a framework globally that obliges countries to adhere to human rights instruments, to promote development, to promote security, to promote peace and promote health, what we'll see at regional and country level is policies being put in place that meet need. And we know already how to do that. Tariq's been very clear. The science is well known. We have policies all over the world, but patchily in place, that really do provide for the needs of citizens. And all we need to do is learn from those best practices and then funnel them out through the world. And that will happen over the next 5 to 10 years. There has been a tipping point. The war on drugs is ending. But as Daniel said, the United Nations as a body may not be the best place to extricate ourselves from that war.
All right. On that note, I'll have to end it there. Thank you very much to all of our guests, Daniel Wolfe, Danny Kushlick, and Tariq Zafar. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can also go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.